McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, welcome to the program. I'm Dennis McCuistion. I'm here with my favorite co-host, Jim Falk. Jim, how are you?
I'm very well, and I'm glad we're going to be talking about this because it's very confusing at times.
It's confusing. The Electoral College is confusing. It is contemporary, and yet it's old all at the same time. So, well, even I wasn't here when the Constitutional Convention was held in 1787. Our founders argued over how the President and Vice President of the United States should be elected. The outcome was something called the Electoral College, even though it wasn't called the Electoral College then. It's a version of which we still use today. Now, on this program, you'll hear just how the Electoral College was designed, what changes have been made, and some of the interesting election outcomes that have resulted in its use. To help us understand this topic, let's meet our expert in the community, and that's a guy named Cal Jillson. Cal, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Dennis.
I think you and I both had other than gray hair when we first started doing this, if I'm not mistaken. And Cal, you've taught out at SMU for over 25 years in political science. You've been involved in the Tower Center, and you've written 7 books, including one called American Government, which is sort of a nice thing. That's what we're going to be talking about. So obviously there's a contemporary issue with electoral colleges, but we want to go back on this program and sort of look at how it came about, even though it wasn't called that at the time. But how did we get to this situation where we elected people that way, this way, and whatever way?
Yeah, the Constitutional Convention of 1787 had the Founding Fathers, who we think did a marvelous job in creating the American political system. But they were less clear on what they needed to do in regard to the executive, because the only national executives that they were familiar with the kings and the emperors of Europe and just tyrants around the world. So there was no Democratic or Republican chief magistrate, as they called it at the time. And so they had a lot of trouble figuring out how they were going to select the chief magistrate and what their powers would be. And during the convention, which lasted about 3.5 months. For the first 3 months, they were not sure how it was going to be decided. So there were 2 principal approaches that they had in mind. One of them was popular election of the chief magistrate, but they quickly came to believe that the people weren't really knowledgeable enough or stable enough to pick the president. And the other option was legislative selection, to have the legislature select the president, but that was so obviously a violation of separation of powers, an idea that they were committed to, that they couldn't really resolve it. And at the very end of the convention, they rejected both of the programs they'd been talking about and developed an electoral college scheme. They did that in a committee late in the process. It's not something that they were convinced of, not something they were clear about, not something they knew how would work. So it's not like other parts of the Constitution that were sacrosanct, that have worked very, very well. This hasn't worked all that well. And so that's why we talk about it today.
Mm-hmm. And let's note, too, that when we're talking about the people, we're really talking about males, white males.
Right. White male property owners, as a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. But even that, in 1787, the founders were convinced that while the people had a certain nobility in mass, they, as individuals, weren't educated enough or sophisticated enough or even informed enough to know a great man in some other part of the country. So they didn't see how the people actually could select a president.
Well, they didn't have cable news. How the heck could they possibly have known?
Didn't have cable news.
I'm amazed that they didn't. As a matter of fact, I think that argument's still made today by both parties, isn't it? Is that you obviously didn't know what you were doing because you voted for this party or that party.
Well, we have had some presidents that people have thought about and wondered how they got into the job. But the founders were very concerned about that. The founders were not Democrats. They were Republicans. And so they were reluctant to allow the common man to have too great a role in politics in general, particularly picking the president.
All right, now when you say Republicans and Democrats, you're talking about with a small r. And please tell that viewer the difference between, I mean, when obviously the famous thing when Ben Franklin walked out of this convention, Mrs. Powell asked him, "What have you given us?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it." What did he mean by that?
Yeah, from Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greece all the way up to the Founding Fathers, democracy was understood to be direct democracy. It was understood to be the Athenian Forum, where all the citizens would come together in person, discuss political issues, and resolve them among themselves. And so the founders knew that all the citizens of the country couldn't come together, so they didn't see how a democracy was actually possible. A republic was a non-hereditary government. It could have a monarch, or it could be aristocratic in character, but it wouldn't be hereditary, and the people would play a partial, limited role in the government. So a republic was a way of sort of encompassing the people with senior, more sophisticated leadership.
So how are the number of electors selected or determined?
Well, the same way that they are selected today. If I remember correctly, it was the 2 United States senators and the number of U.S. House seats that you have. So today we have 36 House seats in Texas, 2 senators, so we have 38 electoral votes.
And again, how were they selected then?
Well, they were selected by state legislatures. And the initial conception when they talked about an electoral college was that the electors would travel, go to the capital, Washington, D.C., once that became the capital. And they thought, well, people of real stature aren't going to want to travel to do this one single job. And if they did travel to the state capital, they might conspire among themselves and make a bad selection or a self-interested selection. So late in the convention, they decided that the electors would caucus in their state capitals, cast their ballots, send them to the capital where they would be counted. And their assumption was that the electors would not have a majority because voting in their individual states, they'd probably vote for a local personality. So there would be no majority choice, and then it would go to the legislature to make a final selection. And they thought that would work just fine, that the larger states, the Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia states, would have the nomination, but the House voting by state would make the final selection. So large states thought they would have the nomination, small states thought they would have the final selection, and there were problems with it from the very beginning.
Well, and one of the things that I think that some of us forget these days is, last I checked, it is called the United States of America. And that whole federalism thing was predicated upon that, was it not? And it was more important then than it seems to be today.
Yeah, that's right. The states pre-existed the nation and were sovereign and had political power, and they had histories going back 150 years in some cases. So they were proud, and when they created the United States of America in the Constitution, their state delegations made sure that the individual states had responsible roles that could not be challenged down the road, that each state had 2 senators, whatever their size, and that the states had a principal role in selecting the president or the chief magistrate. And that role still exists and is valued by the publics of the states and by the state governments themselves.
The other thing, too, is that the president and vice president didn't run on a ticket the way they do now. And
yeah.
So that had to create a situation
right.
about this.
One of the first major sort of collapses of the Electoral College was in 1796, when Vice President to George Washington, John Adams, was running for his first term, challenged by Thomas Jefferson, and Adams won narrowly, but Jefferson got the second most Electoral College votes, and so Adams became president, Jefferson became vice president, and Adams ignored Vice President Jefferson for his entire term.
Because they were in different parties. And so I think it was the 12th, wasn't it the 12th Amendment was passed? It did what, basically?
Yeah, the 12th Amendment said In the future, each elector will cast 2 votes. One of them has to be for somebody not in their